There's no new handouts. We'll just be utilizing from what has been given the last 2 weeks here on our last day together this Tuesday morning. Maybe if we could again start as we have been starting with the Jubilee prayer that you had gotten a copy of. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Together let us pray. Father in heaven, may the faith you have given us in your Son, Jesus Christ, our brother, and the flame of charity enkindled in our hearts by the Holy Spirit, reawaken in us the blessed hope for the coming of your kingdom. May your grace transform us into tireless cultivators of the seeds of the gospel. May those seeds transform from within both humanity and the whole cosmos in the sure expectation of a new heaven and a new earth, when, with the powers of evil vanquished, your glory will shine eternally. May the grace of the Jubilee reawaken in us, pilgrims of hope, a yearning for the treasures of heaven. May that same grace spread the joy and peace of our Redeemer throughout the earth. To you, our God, eternally blessed, be glory and praise forever. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So, for today, I simply would like to go through a couple of points from the handout that you got last week that were several pages of the compendium of the social doctrine of the church. I want to highlight 2 of the principles. Right, remember it talked about, and I mentioned towards the end of last week's time together, the principles upon which Catholic social doctrine, social teaching is based. And so I want to sort of just highlight briefly 2 of them that are listed up there, the common good and solidarity. Very important ideas that, of course, predate this compendium and go back a long way. But in the case of solidarity, first of all, have any of you heard that term before? Or just seen it, or maybe, come across it. It actually was also became pretty potent as a political force in the 1980s when John Paul II was Pope. And that's because in his native Poland, the political movement that pushed back against communism in his native Poland was known by the Polish word Solidarność, right? That's sort of cool because in all the Slavic language you get all these consonants together. I have a friend who is fluent in Spanish, and sometimes I like to tease him. I'll throw him a German word or a Polish word, and he goes, I don't know where to start. I don't see any vowels. But Solidarność is sort of easier to pronounce for us, simply because it's rooted in the same Latin word as our word solidarity. That's what it means. So that was this movement in Poland, led by, maybe some of you might remember, Lech Walesa, who himself had been imprisoned, but then became the first president after the fall of communism in Poland. But Pope John Paul, of course, a very potent figure that really held this idea up, not just for the political purposes in his native Poland, but this is at the root of solidarity as we look at it, at least from a big 40,000-foot view here in a moment. Solidarity is a key principle to really understand the church's teaching on a lot of these issues, on the whole consistent ethic of life from conception to natural death, and what that all sort of entails. So in that light, let's flip, if you have your handout on maybe, I did ask if you had time to maybe look at it during the course of the week. Again, it's heavily, philosophical and sort of talks in big language because it's seeking to try to establish like sort of the big overarching principles. But and remember last week I read and we looked at the fact that of these principles, you can't just sort of like lift them out and they don't sort of interface with the others. They do. And so that always has to be a necessary statement that even as we sort of like look at them individually, and in particular these two, remember that they're always connected together. So the dignity of the human person, subsidiarity, the universal destination of goods, and all of those things are always seen together, in addition to the common good and solidarity, right? So if you look at number 164, we're referencing paragraph numbers. Number 164. This is where the common good is first sort of is presented. And I'm just going to read a couple of the paragraphs and pause and offer some explanation. The principle of the common good, to which every aspect of social life must be related if it is to attain its fullest meaning, stems from the dignity, unity, and equality of all people. Right? So that makes, basic sense. According to its primary and broadly accepted sense, the common good indicates the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. You notice it has a footnote and it's quoting from the Second Vatican Council document that I talked about, or we heard about on the first day, Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution of the church in the modern world, and we sort of looked a little bit, scratched the surface, referencing that. So it's quoting there that the common good indicates the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. The common good does not consist in the simple sum of the particular goods of each subject of a social entity. So it's not that, I have my stuff, you have your stuff, and she has her stuff, and he has his stuff, and then it's all sort of like brought together with our various things that we have, and that therein lies this sort of like amalgamation of all of these individual parts. No, that's not what it is. It continues. Belonging to everyone and to each person, it is and remains common, right? How we sort of parse that word, meaning, it's for one and for all, right? It's communal. Our word common, communal are related to each other. It is and remains common because it is indivisible, and because only together is it possible to attain it, increase it, and safeguard its effectiveness with regard also to the future. Just as the moral actions of an individual are accomplished in doing what is good, so too the actions of a society attain their full stature when they bring about the common good. The common good, in fact, can be understood as the social and community dimension of the moral good, right? We're all individually in pursuit of the moral good, and you can sort of see that the common good is that collective pursuit of that which is moral for each person individually and all persons together, right? So that's why we can speak of, not just, an individual, something that is good for an individual and something that is evil for an individual, but also for a society, right? That there are goods commonly held that we seek together to promote the dignity of the human person from conception to natural death, as a society, as a community, as the police, right? That, the political ramifications of all of that. And there can also be, we would call it like social sin or social evil. Those things that together the society needs to work on because it's not promoting the moral good as a common good for all of the people, right? And so this is where that whole notion so you can sort of see there's going to be like this strong link between the common good and solidarity. It unpacks it a little more there and then the next paragraph. So let's just read that, and then I'll jump over to then looking at solidarity briefly. Again, this is just a big, big picture view of this. All of these things, remember, is that these principles, though, can't just sort of stay up here in the stratosphere, right? That they are embodied, they're in flesh, they're instantiated, is the word. They're brought down to earth in particular situations and experiences and people in the pursuit of, as we try to do that which is morally good, right, for individuals, and commonly good for society, to sort of piggyback on what the compendium of the social doctrine of the church here is offering. So it continues, a society that wishes and intends to remain at the service of the human being at every level, right, every level, is a society that has the common good, the good of all people and of the whole person, right, in all stages of life and development. In the womb and outside of the womb, right? From conception to natural death. This is why the church's teaching often, is all-encompassing. Why we're against abortion, why we're against euthanasia, why we're against the death penalty, why we are supporting and promoting the marginalized, of which, of course, in particular, this series of classes sort of focusing on the stranger or the migrant in a particular way, and all other situations of human beings in life, right? It's a consistent ethic of life, right? So, it's the good of all people and of the whole person as its primary goal. The human person cannot find fulfillment in himself, that is, apart from the fact that he exists with others and for others. Okay? So, sometimes you'll have this tension, in people that will want to sort of say, well, there's more of an emphasis on this particular issue or that particular reality because that seems to be more important. But this is when then we're not sort of holding the whole picture of the social doctrine of the church together, in particular the principles together. So the dignity of the human person, right? The common good, solidarity, subsidiarity, right? The universal destination of goods and the others. Remember, as I said earlier, they have to always be seen together. When we sort of separate them out, then, all of a sudden people, it appears like they can, or movements or groups might start picking and choosing, right? But again, the church is presenting a holistic, the whole entire picture of the pursuit of the moral good individually, which gets expressed, societally, communally speaking. I know I'm sort of beating a dead horse here, but gets expressed then in the pursuit of the common good, okay? And so we exist with others and for others. And maybe that's why in our world today, when we sort of speak about the common good, it's like people say, what? Or else people feel offended because, well, I've got my rights, right? First here in Texas, my rights. And they forget about, no, you also have your responsibilities, right? Rights and responsibilities are coterminous with each other. They correlate. And so it's not just about rights, right? Because that's sort of like this hyper-individualist water, if you will, or air, to mix my metaphors, that we swim in or that we breathe. And this can sort of infect people in the church, too. It's just there. We've raised the level of the individual to such a high degree that sometimes the notions of the common good and solidarity sort of like fall into second or third place. And we forget that duty that we have to each other and also collectively. I'm sorry, some of you Star Trek nerds? Yeah, raise your hand. So I grew up on Next Generation, right? So, child of the high school in the late 80s and early 90s. So one of the super big enemies of the Federation was the Borg, right? I don't know if you remember the Borg. The Borg was sort of like, it's like the perfect example of the collective, right? The communal. It's sort of like maybe a perfect illustration of like communism, right? The individual is so pressed down that it has no identity at all, except in service to the collective, right? The church is not saying that at all, right? Obviously, the whole solidarity movement was a pushback against that, that idea, in Eastern European communism, in Poland of like the 1980s, 70s, and 80s. But there, here in this country and maybe in the Western world, we could sort of say what has happened. It's not that the collective is supreme. It's not, really. What sort of is supreme is the individual in almost, and I would dare say, in almost an idolatrous way. It's a hyper-individualism that then the duty to the community gets sort of like stamped down. And this is what, the system in which we sort of work, capitalism, can have a dark side and the unbridled effects of it, right? And so you always have to hold in tension all of these principles to be able to say that allows the full flourishing of the human person individually and of the society as a whole, okay? So that's sort of my little, those of you that know Star Trek, and hopefully I made it, to those of you who don't, you can sort of get the picture. If not, you can Google it, all right? The Borg. The Borg. B-O-R-G. Anyway, so it just goes on, and I'll finish this paragraph for the common good. This truth does not simply require that he live, that is, the human person live with others at various levels of social life, but that he seek unceasingly in actual practice and not merely at the level of ideas, and that's what I was talking about, the good, that is, the meaning and truth found in existing forms of social life. Social life is not just about you go to the bar, okay, and pop open a beer. This is our life in society, our life in community, right? Our life, in the police, in the city, literally, right? And that from which we get our word politics, right? It's our existing together, as a human community. No expression of social life, from the family to intermediate social groups, associations, enterprises of an economic nature, cities, regions, states, up to the community of peoples and nations, can escape the issue of its own common good, in that this is a constitutive element of its significance and the authentic reason for its very existence. Right? And so, this is why, we have to, rediscover in a powerful way this idea of the common good. Okay? So and it goes on again, but I just want to present that, or note those, the couple of introductory ideas that, again, we're sort of scratching the surface or presented with the 40,000-foot view of this very, very important principle. Now, if you jump over to solidarity, which is on page 84, and it's at number 192. Paragraph number 192. Let's sort of just tease it out again from the big picture level, right? I know this is sort of heady, but I'm going to then instantiate this, right? Bring it into, the particular when we sort of unpack a couple of biblical stories here in a moment, all right? So, and again, we'll sort of see how solidarity and common good are at work, even though the biblical stories don't even use that language, but we see then how the church over time, and human life over time, can reflect on, we see how those are at work, right? Particularly in reference to welcoming the stranger. So, 192, solidarity highlights in a particular way the intrinsic social nature of the human person, the equality of all in dignity and rights, and the common path of individuals and peoples towards an ever more committed unity, right? It's our togetherness, solidarity, right? We're made strong together, sort of the idea of this multisyllabic or polysyllabic word. Never before has there been such a widespread awareness of the bond of interdependence between individuals and peoples, which is found at every level. The very rapid expansion in ways and means of communication in real time, such as those offered by information technology, the extraordinary advances in computer technology, the increased volume of commerce and information exchange, all bear witness to the fact that for the first time since the beginning of human history, it is now possible, at least technically, to establish relationships between people who are separated by great distances and are unknown to each other. This was published in like the mid-2000s, like I think 2003, 2004. So it was after the internet was obviously getting going in a pretty big way, but it was before really the social media platforms or even the smartphone. So this is about 20 years old, but notice it's almost like sort of prophetic. Because, I mean, just, now, with just the sheer rapidity and instantaneity, right, instantaneousness of communication and social media and all of those types of things, right? This was before that, but it's already sort of like noting that, look, this is a new reality in human life, and it can either be for the good, or as we can see, it can be for the not good, right? And how voices get sort of, if you will, individual voices get sort of this megaphone, right? And it can become all of a sudden, moments of just profound division and outrage and separation as these sort of individual constituents are battling it out, right? And so that's the dark side, right? It's the dark side of it. And it's why we then have to always constantly say, how is this promoting solidarity? How is this promoting the common good? How is this promoting the dignity of the human person, right? In all levels. So it continues. In the presence of the phenomenon of interdependence and its constant expansion, however, there persist in every part of the world stark inequalities between developed and developing countries. Inequalities stoked also by various forms of exploitation, oppression, and corruption that have a negative influence on the internal and international life of many states. Right? States talking about countries. The acceleration of interdependence between persons and peoples needs to be accomplished by equally intense efforts on the ethical social plane, right? The social level of an ethics, that's moral, in order to avoid the dangerous consequences of perpetrating injustice on a global scale. This would have very negative repercussions even in the very countries that are presently more advantaged. Okay, so it's just sort of offering some initial ideas, but 193 then, just to sort of finish there, that top paragraph. The new relationships of interdependence between individuals and peoples, which are de facto forms of solidarity, have to be transformed into relationships tending towards genuine, ethical, social solidarity. This is a moral requirement inherent within all human relationships. Solidarity is seen, therefore, under two complementary aspects. That of a social principle, right? Our life in society as a group, and that of a moral virtue, right? It is a moral virtue, right? Solidarity must be seen above all in its values and moral virtue that determines the order of institutions. And then it goes into talking about like what it would say. We talk about structural sin, right? So that societies can sort of portray a structural sin. Because again, they're not seeking to lift up and promote the dignity of the human person at every stage of development and in all conditions to the extent that they are able. And often this is because it raises the individual to such a high point that, again, that collective responsibility or that social responsibility or the whole notion of responsibility just sort of falls because everybody's saying, it's about my rights, right? It's my rights. And nobody's going to tell me that, I can't have my rights. Again, rights and responsibilities together. Okay, so that's big, heady stuff. Let's see how it's sort of is brought down to earth, right? In the experiential, in the day-to-day, right? And we do that, I think, best by going to stories, right? In particular, the stories that Jesus tells, because that's how he taught. He taught in stories. One of his most famous stories is, as it's come down to us, is the so-called parable of the Good Samaritan, right? So if you have a Bible, or if you don't, I did the hard work, or Maria did the hard work, and if you have that list of biblical references, it's there, reprinted for you, because I'm in solidarity with you, right? So I did it for you. So if you don't, you can look on that. It's on the second page, and I'll just sort of begin to unpack this. So stories are the way Jesus taught. And we're going to sort of see, I think, the ideas, the big ideas of solidarity and the common good sort of express themselves in the story of the parable of the Good Samaritan. So it's in Luke's Gospel, chapter 10, verses 25 to 37. And by the way, it sort of focuses a big chunk of Pope Francis's encyclical Fratelli Tutti that you also have selections of. I'll make reference to one of those here later. Remember, this was his encyclical on fraternity and social friendship. It gets its title, Fratelli Tutti, so it's not Tutti Frutti, right? Fratelli Tutti, coming from a line of Saint Francis of Assisi, where he's referencing all of humanity as his brothers and sisters. That's what it means, Fratelli Tutti, brothers all, or in a more expanded sense, brothers and sisters all together. Right? That's what the Italian means there, the title of it. So, but the parable of the Good Samaritan is going to be a major focusing element for Pope Francis in that document. So this is how it starts, right? Before there's the setup to the telling of this story. And this is how the setup goes, right? There was a scholar in the law who stood up to test Jesus and said, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Okay, so that's a good question. But notice he's a scholar of the law, right? So this means he knows the Torah, right? And of course, Jesus is a good teacher because he doesn't answer the question, right? He asks a question back. This is how, teachers, typically operate. They're kind of trying to educate, lead out from the student or the pupil, right, the answer and have them sort of begin to try to articulate what it is. So Jesus said to him, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" And so this guy says back, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." Okay, that's a good answer because that's what Jesus is going to tell him. He replied to him, "You've answered correctly. Do this, and you will live." So this guy has answered correctly. He's given the great answer. But as you and I know, sometimes it's easy to give the answer, but then we don't truly, like if you're sort of cramming for a test and you just learn what absolutely needs to be known, right? And, but then what does it mean, right? It's like the next level or the next stage. You can give a good answer, and this guy does, but without really knowing or allowing yourself to know what are the implications. What does it really mean, right? You can sort of robotically, parrot back a response, but without really knowing what it's about. Okay, so what has this guy said that Jesus says, yeah, that's correct? Well, he has articulated as Mark and Matthew's gospel will present a similar scene, of course, without the story of the Good Samaritan. But when Jesus is asked what are the two great commandments, Jesus himself says, Deuteronomy 6, Hear, O the Shema Israel, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Right? And then he says, and the second commandment is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And remember the first night, or the first day, 2 weeks ago, we looked at where that you shall love your neighbor as yourself comes from. It comes from the book of Leviticus 19:18 in the Holiness Code. And so Jesus brings together Deuteronomy 6 and Leviticus 19, right? When asked, what are the two greatest commandments? That's how Mark and Matthew, basically with some differences, formulates that scene. Well, in Luke, it's formulated this way. The scholar actually says the right answer. He cites Deuteronomy 6. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. Except he doesn't separate out the two as number one and number two. In Luke's presentation of it, this is very important because it sets up the scene then for the story that Jesus is going to tell in a moment. It's presented as one commandment, like one coin with two sides. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself, so that the love of God is expressed in the love of neighbor. Right? And if one of those is missing, it's like the whole house of cards is going to come crashing down, falling down. Okay? And that's a key thing. You can't particularly from Luke's perspective, the Gospel of Luke's perspective, and even I would say as it's portrayed in Matthew and Mark, and then just throughout the New Testament, like what St. Paul says, and in the letter of James, and the first letter of John, many, many other texts, is that, sort of as first letter of John expresses it, how can you claim to love the God that you cannot see if you do not love the brother or sister that you can see, right? And so you don't have then an authentic sort of abiding by the commandments as somehow one of those two sides of that same coin, the command to love, or the duty to love, is missing, right? Love of God and love of neighbor are intricately linked together. Just like sort of the principles upon which the social doctrine, the social teaching of the church is based, they're linked together. Right? So this guy said the right answer. You've answered correctly. Do this and you will live. Some of you, I don't know if some of you were at Mass on Sunday. Well, I had the 4 later Masses, but and remember this past Sunday was the Luke's version of sort of some of the language that we find more famously in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel, but Luke has a version of that called the Sermon on the Plain. And a lot of it's the same, love your enemies and pray for those who mistreat you and all of that. And then, of course, the golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And that idea is not unique to Jesus. It's actually in Judaism. And I told the story of the 2 rabbis, Shammai and Hillel, in my homily. Because Rabbi Hillel, they were sort of contemporaneous with Jesus, or maybe lived a little bit after him. He articulates the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, but from a different sort of perspective, right? The story goes is that there was this Roman Gentile who came up to rabbis Shammai and Hillel and to ask them, hey, tell me the meaning of the Torah standing on one foot, right? It's hard to do that, and the Torah is big, right? Remember, 613 mitzvot, 613 commandments, in addition to all the stories that are, what's the Torah? The first 5 books, right? Genesis through through Deuteronomy. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, what we also call the Pentateuch. So this guy comes up to rabbis Shammai and Hillel and says, tell me the meaning of the Torah standing on one foot. He's sort of like, is he mocking them, or... So Shammai becomes sort of incensed and, thinks this is an affront and isn't going to engage. And in fact, he's offended and he beats him off with the ruler, right? Maybe not the best sort of introduction, Maybe a little more magnanimity was called for in the moment. But Hillel says, okay, he stands on one foot, and then he says this: what is hateful to you, do not do to another fellow man. That is the entirety of the Torah. That's the entirety of the Torah. Everything else is commentary. Go and learn it. So he articulates the golden rule, what we call the golden rule, from the negative sort of position, right? It's like, do not do to others what you would not want done to yourself. Do not do to others what you would not want done to yourself, right? Imagine me standing on one foot. He says that's the entirety of Torah. Everything else is commentary, right? Go and learn it, or go, learn it, and do it. So Jesus, when he says, you've answered correctly, do this and you will live, he's sort of like, in some sense, channeling that expression of like Hillel's idea that, look, this is all learned and done in the doing of it, in the praxis, right? In the practical application. It's not just the mere theorizing or philosophizing or just sort of like the highfalutin principles of something. It's rather done and learned in the doing of it. So Hillel says, go and learn it, right? It's saying, go and do it, and you'll learn it. And that's the entirety of Torah, he says, right? What is you find hateful for you, do not do to a fellow human being, right? It gets expressed positively by Jesus. Do to others what you would want them to do to you. Okay? But I was sort of like bringing that point home that sometimes sometimes we need to hear it from a different perspective to really, because I mean that golden rule has become so used and overused. It's like it's lost its meaning, right? Maybe it's helpful to like change perspective and consider maybe I need to proverbially or metaphorically stand on my one foot, right? And then hear it expressed in the negative and really plumb the depths of, oh, it means that, or it means this, right? So Jesus is sort of like saying, do this and you will live. Right, so here's the challenge then presented to this scholar of the law who's answered correctly. So what does he then do? But because he wished to justify himself, he said to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Right? Now, is he sort of saying this from the vantage point of he really wants to know? Or is he sort of like his smug, maybe sort of the self-smugness, like, just leave me at the level of the theoretical, right? I'm good at that, okay? But this is an invitation then for Jesus to tell a story. Notice that the text says he wished to justify himself. He wished to make himself righteous, right? Or to appear to be in right relationship. So there is sort of ambiguity as to, is he really open to learning what this means? And it may be that he is. Or is he sort of like, you could hear like, well, and who is my neighbor? And so Jesus is going to tell a story. Remember, he best teaches in stories, right? And so this is a story. Famous, we know it. Of course, we know it, but again, it's lost its punch down through the centuries because, we think we know it, but what is it really saying and challenging us, right? So a man fell victim to robbers as he went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. They stripped and beat him and went off, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down that road, but when he saw him, he passed by on the opposite side. Likewise, a Levite came to the place. And when he saw him, he passed by on the opposite side. But a Samaritan traveler who came upon him was moved with compassion at the sight. He approached the victim, poured oil and wine over his wounds, and bandaged them. Then he lifted him up on his own animal, took him to an inn, and cared for him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper with the instruction, take care of him. If you spend more than what I have given you, I shall repay you on my way back. So that's the story. And then Jesus is going to then ask like the punchy question there at the end. But this is the story. So let's sort of like pause there and, break it open. And of course, there's been a lot of ink spilled down through the centuries on interpretation of this. First of all, we have an unidentified person, a man. In the Greek, this is simply tis, which means a certain one, an individual, a someone. No name, fell victim to robbers. He was traveling alone. It's dangerous to travel alone. And that's sort of is sometimes the question, why was he traveling alone? He usually traveled part of a group. As he went down from Jerusalem, so he's probably a Jew, and Jerusalem is high, altitude-wise, in the hill country. Jericho is low, it's below sea level. In fact, it's the most continuously lived in place on earth that is below sea level, going back like maybe 9,000 years. Right? This is as you're going down to the Dead Sea, which is below and substantially below sea level. Okay? So this idea of going down also. Right? So there's a lot of, I could offer theological geography, but we'd be going down a rabbit hole, then no pun intended, as we go down Jericho. But notice, so we don't know who he is, and then they stripped, so he's removed, his clothing is removed. And that's a key point. It's not just a simple sort of, well, that's interesting. That's a key point, because clothing usually identifies you in the ancient world as to which tribe you belong to, which clan, which group, which people. The fact that he's stripped means this is just any sort of Joe Schmo, right? There's no identifying features as to who this might be. He's stripped, they beat him, and went off, leaving him half dead. So he could be alive, he could be dead. You know, you'd have to really go up and investigate. So then, immediately, the text says, not immediately, but a priest. He's going from Jerusalem to Jericho, perhaps having already done his duty, performed his ritual obligations in the temple in Jerusalem. This is a Jewish priest, right? The offering of sacrifice and all of that. There's a lot of legislation in the Torah about the liturgical and ritual duties of the Jewish priesthood. There's a lot of language about that, right? He happened to be going down that road. But when he saw him, so he sees him, he passed by on the opposite side. Now, many of us instantly make sort of like a moral judgment. And maybe that's okay. But realize first and foremost that there's all this language of in the Torah about what's clean and unclean. And a corpse is unclean. And if you touch a corpse, a dead body, you make yourself ritually unclean, and you have to go back through this whole process of being deemed clean. And it's a very foreign concept to us, but it just permeates. This is the whole idea of why, the law of kosher and dietary regulations, not eating pork, and many other things that are done. It's all there in like Torah, and then in the commentary on Torah, in the Mishnah and the Talmud. But effectively, this priest is sort of like, he has a duty and responsibility to the temple and the liturgy, and he sees this person and he's not sure if he's dead or not. He might be dead, but he doesn't want to get involved because he's got these other duties. And we can sort of judge him. But remember that, as with so many of us, there's often a multiplicity of ideas going on at any one time. And so, obviously, the priest is instantiating at that moment his duty towards those ritual, clean, unclean obligations as delineated in the Torah. Although, we could sort of say he's leaving Jerusalem and going down to Jericho, so presumably his responsibility back at the temple might not be for a while, so that he could go through the process of being deemed clean again, had he sought to intervene. So it's complex, right? As a lot of things in life. First, Jesus is ultimately going to say, you know what, it's not really that complex. But that's not quite there yet, right? So then we have the second stage cleric, the Levite, right? This is sort of like a lesser order from the priests. And they also have temple duties and things like that. There's a lot of legislation about the Levites. It says the same thing. He came to the place, he saw him, right? Passed by on the opposite side. Now, for the original hearers of Jesus, presumably speaking to a Jewish audience, they're going to say, okay, well, the priest and the Levite, because they had those ritual, liturgical duties and stuff like that. But now, some Jewish guy is going to be, if this is sort of the setup, right? He's going to come by and he's going to intervene, right? Except Jesus doesn't say a Jewish guy, he says a Samaritan traveler came upon him, was moved with compassion at the sight. And this is where we're both blessed by and weighted down by tradition. Even the language of the Good Samaritan has entered into our lingo. It's like somebody that does good for somebody else, usually in an emergency or in an emergent situation. But there's a punchiness to this that you and I miss unless we have done some study. If I were to tell this story to make it applicable to our time, right? I said, well, a Catholic priest went by, and because he was going to some other sick call, he didn't have time, so he passed by on the other side, right? And next was, a lawyer who had a duty that he had to get to, and he didn't have time, right? So he passed by on the other side. But they're good Americans, right? All of a sudden. But an Arab, or maybe better, like an Al-Qaeda member or Taliban. That's the idea. When Jesus said Samaritan, this is like the proverbial, if this was a chalkboard, right? This is the proverbial nails going down the chalkboard, right? When we have those things, and how people cringe when they hear that sound, or somebody really react in a very visceral way. When Jesus said a Samaritan, they're probably his audience is saying, what? Because in their minds, Samaritans were less than. They hated them, and vice versa. There's no love lost between Jews and Samaritans. Samaritans, without going down the rabbit hole, which will take us, till the mid-afternoon today, they're sort of like they are Jews, but they're not. They don't accept the totality of the prophets. They have other traditions as well. And so the pure Jerusalem Jew, right, looked very much down upon them. There was skirmishes back and forth between Judea and Samaria. Remember, Jesus is from Galilee, right? He lives up there. That's where Nazareth is. Samaria is between Galilee in the north and Judea in the south. And Jews typically did not want to pass through or go through Samaria unless they met a Samaritan, because they considered them unclean, unwashed, lesser than human beings, reprobates, sort of half-breeds. There's real cultural, religious, and a type of ethnic, although they're related to each other ethnically, sort of enmity and hatred. Okay? So it's again, you have to to make this mean something for us, it's who in our mind as a culture, as a people, is sort of not just the other, but the enemy other. Right? And so maybe something from, the last 20 years of stuff with the Middle East and things like that. From an American perspective that sort of reveals what are the hidden biases and prejudices in each one of us. Or maybe not on just that national, cultural level, but maybe on a more personal level too. Who is that person that is, that we want to see roasting in hell? We all have a top 10 list, okay? And you have to be honest with yourselves. Who is it that you want to see burning in hell, right? And so, it's that person, right? This is the idea. Jesus is saying, the one that you would not expect in 1,000 years, he's the one that turns out to show compassion, or he's moved with compassion, and then he does it, right? He does it. The praxis of it, the doing of it, the practicing of it. He lifts him up, right? Pours wine and oil on his wounds, bandages him, takes him to the inn. He even goes overboard with the innkeeper, saying, take care of him. Here's money to do that. If you go over what this takes care of, I will, on coming back, pay you more. So he now indebts himself to the innkeeper. They were notorious for being cheats. So the innkeeper might say, ooh, sees big money signs in his eyes and said, this is a way to get something. And he might well overcharge the Samaritan as he travels back. But he enters into a relationship. Notice it's all about the caring for this person and he doesn't know who this guy is. Remember, he's stripped of his clothing and his identity. He just sees a human being, or took time rather, to see and notice a human being and then to act. And the word there, moved with compassion, is sort of this really rich Greek word. This is literally the movement of the guts. This is where a visceral reaction occurs. This is where either when we see a scene that so moves us, we become sick by it, or it also motivates us to action, right? Regardless of all of the supposed boundary-defining things. Well, is he a Jew, right? This guy can surmise he was traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, and then he said he could have been a Jew. But the Samaritan, he acts, right? And so we then sort of see what I was talking about the first night when we looked really especially at the commandment from Leviticus 19 that Jesus, picks up and highlights, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. We really sort of see that that commandment is sort of brought to full flourishing in this story, right? In that what Jesus seeks to highlight from Torah is what we would call the moral law, right? There's a lot of the ritual legislation, a lot of the liturgical legislation, there's a lot of the stuff around Sabbath, and sort of identifying features of the dietary regulations and many, many other things about how worship in the temple is supposed to go. And those are important. And I'm not trying to denigrate them at all, but Jesus does seem to sort of raise up when he's asked, what are the two great commandments? And he says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And then in Luke's sort of version of it, they're brought together in such a way that there is really only one commandment to love that's manifested in loving God as we love our neighbor and vice versa. Right? And so that the Samaritan, this apparently hated enemy figure, he's the one that sort of represents this. Right, so this is a big challenge to the original hearers of Jesus, but he tells the story to say, this is the guy that sort of gets, because he tells the scholar of the law, look, you answered correctly, right? Do this and you will live, right? But he says, this is what it means. So it's not just about someone who does good in an emergent situation. It's the fact that the someone who does good just might be the one that you least expect or would never have considered in 1,000 years because of ethnic bias, prejudice, racial bias, prejudice, all these sort of preconceptions that any of us can bring to our encounters with other human beings and stuff like that. There at the end, he asks the question, which of these three, in your opinion, was neighbor to the robber's victim? He answered, the one who treated him with mercy. Jesus said to him, just like Hillel says to the Roman Gentile, asking him, tell me the whole meaning of Torah, standing on one foot. As Hillel tells that guy, what is hateful to you, do not do to another human being. That is the entirety of Torah. Everything else is commentary. go and learn it. Jesus says, go and do likewise. Go and do likewise. Right? So it's a very rich text about the other, and not just the other as stranger. I mean, because we can all sort of have these categorizations. Well, that's a good stranger. This is the one that you hate, and that you love to hate, weirdly, right? They did good. They're the stranger that did good. So it's a very challenging text. You know, when we sort of remove the cultural accretions down through the ages, by which we think we know what it means, right? It's not just simply about the doing of good to someone, though it is that, but it's that the one who is the vehicle of that is actually instantiating, embodying, and fleshing love of God and love of neighbor, and it's the person I would least expect, sort of like the proverbial fingernails on the chalkboard when you hear it. It's that one, right? So let's pause a moment, about 5 minutes, if you want any refreshments, or hit the bathrooms, and we'll reconvene. And I'll look briefly at just another story, very briefly, and then we'll conclude. Okay. I can go. Okay, let's reconvene so we can try to finish on time. So that's a very rich text about the other, and again, the degrees to which the stranger, the other, is just not simply other or different, but as regards this particular original audience that Jesus is telling the story to, this would be like the hated other, right? That, sort of has a lot of cultural and ethnic and other sort of baggage associated with it. The Pope, in that document, Fratelli Tutti, and I reproduced this, or Maria did, several of the sections there, especially from where he really deals with the parable as sort of the focusing point. So if you have that, I think we gave that out last week. It's the first paragraph, number 80. He says, the Pope does, Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan in answer to the question, who is my neighbor? The word neighbor in the society of Jesus' time usually meant those nearest us. It was felt that help should be given primarily to those of one's own group and race. For some Jews of that time, Samaritans were looked down upon, considered impure, and vice versa. They were not among those to be helped. Jesus himself, a Jew, completely transforms this approach. He asks us not to decide who is close enough to be our neighbor, but rather that we ourselves become neighbors to all. I think that's a key line there. He asks us not to decide, it's not our decision, who is close enough to be our neighbor, but rather that we ourselves become neighbors to all. And this is sort of goes to the heart of the thing about why we do what we do, Do we do what we do simply because of who the person is in front of us? Or do we do what we do simply because of who we proclaim or confess that we are, regardless of who it is that is in front of us in some form of need or whatever, right? Not, we're going to go through a whole sort of checklist. Well, you check this, you check this, you check this, you check this, and then I'll decide to help you, right? Or do we do what we do simply because of who we say we are? Does that make sense? That's the point. So, in that line also, there's a really rich story, and some of you know how much I love this story from the Old Testament. And just briefly, it's sort of like an entire book about the other sort of coming into, a new society, a new people, in which there's a lot of historical baggage about the relationships between these two groups. And yet she, and she is a she, is sort of, the exemplar of, like, the prime virtue of the covenant, right? Chesed, loving kindness, fidelity. And this is the story of Ruth. It's very short, 4 chapters. You could read it in, 20, 30 minutes or less. Again, it's a more developed narrative than, because the story of the Good Samaritan, although it really packs a punch, it's very brief, as you see. It's just a few verses. Ruth's a little more, but still a very short story. But it's a powerful text from the Old Testament that again sort of comes to this point. What is it basically about? Well, it's basically about this woman named Ruth, who's not a Jew. In fact, she's a Moabite. And Moabites are like less than human beings in the sight of the Israelites. So their sort of origin story, at least according to Israelite propaganda, you have to go back to the book of Genesis, chapter 19, and the whole story of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And what is that sort of saying? Well, this is sort of saying that, remember the visitors that in the previous chapter of Genesis came to Abraham, and he received them and welcomed them, and it turns out that they're divine, or this is God. And then two of them continue on to see Abraham's nephew Lot in Sodom, who had taken up residence in Sodom. So Lot receives them and welcomes them. It shows the ancient virtue of hospitality, which, by the way, is, the Greek translations of the Old Testament, and then in the New Testament, this word is philoxenia, which literally means hospitality is, it's not just doing coffee and donuts, though that's always an important thing for hospitality. But hospitality literally means, philoxenia literally means love of the stranger. So when you're showing hospitality, you're receiving the stranger into your own, right, into your sphere. So Abram does that, Lot does that. Of course, then apparently a lot of people in Sodom want to do some form of that in a very violent way to these guests, right? So this sort of like gang that wants to have their way and ways with these two guests that have come to visit Lot, and it's not in a very welcoming way, but a violent way. They want to rape them, it seems. Show inhospitality while they think they're being hospitable. Anyway, they're pounding at the door. Send those two guys out that are at your house. What does Lot do? By the way, this story is never read in the lectionary. But it's in the Bible. So what do they do? Or what does Lot do? He says, no, not these two guys. I'll tell you what, I'll let you have my daughters. Poor women, right? They always get completely... So Lot, their father's on the verge of throwing them out to this rape gang. Anyway, the moment God intervenes, fire and brimstone falls upon Sodom. The two divine figures lead Lot and his family to escape, right? So, fast forward a day or two. Do you think Daddy's little girls have forgotten what just almost happened? No. So what happens? Oh, this just gets worse. So they get Daddy drunk, right? And they both have sexual relations with Dad. Yeah, this is the word of the Lord. Okay. And the product of one of the daughters' unions with her father Lot, is named what? Moab. So Moab, in the Israelite mindset, is not only less than less, they're disgustingly less than less. They're the product of an incestuous relationship, right? So that's how an Israelite sort of hears and understands Moab. And this is because of centuries of back and forth and, enmity and animosity, and just hatred back and forth, each one believing their own propaganda, if you will, about the other. So fast forward centuries and centuries, and you have the Jewish leadership class and their offspring coming back from exile in Babylon after the Babylonian exile, when Persia had come to the fore and King Cyrus allows the leadership class to return home. So they begin the process of rebuilding the temple. Remember, that had all been destroyed, and Jerusalem had been razed, R-A-Z-E-D, that is destroyed by the Babylonians. And so, in sort of what that gut punch was to their ethnic and cultural identity and stuff like that, upon returning home, they really set up very definite and defined boundaries and borders about what's in and what's out, who's in and who's out. And they are aiming for purity, right? And part of that means we don't want any foreigners in our midst. And so if you read the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which aren't commonly read by Catholics, but they're part of the Old Testament, okay? Ezra and Nehemiah, that sort of relates this whole sort of story of the rebuilding and things like that, but there's a lot of this anti-foreigner legislation and language in Ezra and Nehemiah in particular, specifically singling out the Moabites. And says, you can't be married to a Moabite woman. If you are, divorce her, right? And all that, they can't be part of the assembly, and listing all sorts of different groups of people. So most scholars and people think that the book of Ruth probably originates in that time period. So we're talking about like the 400s BC, and the sort of when they're and you can sort of understand this. They're establishing, hey, we almost were decimated and lost our identity, so we're going to really firm it up. It's this sort of like circling of the wagons, this battening down the hatches of what's in and what's out. And any of us, as individuals and also as nations and groups of people, can do this, right? And we see it time and time again in human history. But the book of Ruth sort of comes in, I like to say, under the radar to present this story, perhaps sort of channeling some oral traditions about the lead up to King David, because that's the whole sort of point of it, that little brief genealogy at the end of the book of Ruth, whereby Ruth, the Moabite, is seen as what? As the great-grandmother of David, the great king himself, right? So it's this really it challenges what was at the time, some of these cultural and ethnic and political assumptions about who the other is. Because the story of Ruth is beautiful. It's a beautiful story. It ends beautifully. It's a very rich text, and I've often, a couple times, have led studies of the Bible on it, in a real deep dive. Like this 4-chapter work usually takes me like 8 weeks to unpack, because we're not just going to do a superficial read of it. You go deep. And the whole point of it is that Ruth, this Moabite, right, she loses her husband, who is an Israelite. He dies. Also, who's with her is Naomi, her mother-in-law, who was the mother of Ruth's husband. And she also had another son, Naomi did, and that guy died too, and Naomi's husband died. So Naomi is a Judahite from Judah, but they had left Judah and gone over to Moab just simply to survive, which was sort of like, well, that's a big sellout. So just the original hearers of this story would go, what? What's all this stuff about Moab? Moab is like the place of refuge. And then this Moabite heroine, right? She's becomes the central figure because everything she does is always oriented towards and focused on the good of her mother-in-law, even leaving her own people. And so here's all these strikes against them, right? So Ruth is first a woman in a man's world. Patriarchy reigns, right? She has no children, right? She's childless. She has no husband. She's a widow. And then lastly, she's a Moabite. And we hate Moabites, right? Again, not just a stranger, but the hated stranger. So those are her marks against her. Naomi has marks against her too, because originally as the story begins, she's actually a foreigner, right? She's a Judahite from Judah living in Moab, right? She is a woman. She loses both of her sons, right? And she's lost her husband. She's a widow too. So it's sort of the story of these two widow women, right, journeying back to Naomi's homeland. And then how will she be received there? And through her own sort of focus on Naomi and just the sheer force of will and how she sort of embodies, again, sort of like the Samaritan embodying mercy for the guy half dead, beaten, naked by the side of the road. Ruth embodies that key quality of the covenant, chesed, which is like covenantal loyalty or loving kindness, mercy, fidelity, tenacity, loyalty, love. It can be translated one of 14 different ways. It's such a rich word, right? This is how you describe like the relation of God to his people in the covenantal loyalty that he has to them in the Old Testament. So this is Ruth, the foreigner, the Moabite foreigner, the hated foreigner. She embodies this towards Naomi, and that has been seen by the people. You know, often it's because sometimes our cultural and ethnic and racial prejudices and biases, they can sort of like percolate underneath the surface of any one of us. And it's often because of the fact we don't know somebody personally of said group. But here, all of a sudden, the townsfolk begin to see Ruth to the point that she is so focused on care for her wounded and hurt mother-in-law, who's seemingly has lost everything, and Ruth has too. But nevertheless, sort of as a manifestation of God working in the background. And God never figures as a very important like character in the story, but he's always sort of in the background. But it's Ruth, you know, that is the vehicle by which, and the great overarching theme of the book of Ruth is this movement from emptiness to fullness again, right? Emptiness to fullness. And she's the vehicle by which that happens in Naomi's life, and it's not unnoticed, right? So here she is, right? You know, the story is thus brought then, I think, and a lot of scholars would think, to sort of like push back against this very narrow-minded sort of circling the wagons, establishing the very strong and in defense, you know, and impenetrable wall, if you will. That again, for a lot of reasons, the Jews of the time, after coming back from the exile, thought they had to do to protect their identity. And we can understand that, except at the same time we have to realize often things are far more complex. And so here's this story about, you know what, in the lineage leading to King David, David himself, the most marginal of marginal people, a hated Moabite widow woman, childless, named Ruth, somehow became a progenitrix, a progenitor, leading to the great King David himself, right? So that's the story, right? It's a powerful story of the stranger, the other, the one who's so different, the enemy other, that again, the people had all sorts of cultural and ethnic and racial baggage and, you know, prejudice and biases concerning that she's the one, right? It's a beautiful story. And again, sort of in an entire book of the Bible sort of dedicated to that, right? As we've sort of seen in some of these other biblical passages, you know, you have, and then there's a lot there about our duty towards the stranger, the foreigner, the migrant. But there, a whole entire book of the Bible is dedicated, like, this is the one, right? This is the one. So, just to conclude, there's that beautiful passage, I think you were given it the first day, by Father Henri Nouwen in his book, Reaching Out, the 3 Movements of the Spiritual Life. And by the way, if you're looking for something for like some Lenten reading that's just very, and he wrote this back in the mid-70s, but it's just a beautiful text, and not long, but if you're looking for some Lenten spiritual reading, I would highly suggest this book, since Lent is going to start in about a week's time, if you're looking for something, right? But this is what part of, you know, the bigger book that he writes. But I really liked this when I found this. He says, in our world full of strangers, estranged from their own past, culture, and country, from their neighbors, friends, and family. In other words, he's saying you can be a stranger in a whole lot of different ways, right? From their deepest self and their God, we witness a painful search for a hospitable place, right? Where life can be lived without fear and where community can be found. Our society seems to be increasingly full of fearful, defensive, aggressive people, anxiously clinging to their property and inclined to look at their surrounding world with suspicion, always expecting an enemy to suddenly appear, intrude, and do harm. But still, that is our vocation, to convert the hostis into a hospes. Those are two Latin words. Hostis is the word for enemy, right? And hospes is the word for guest. And it lies at the root of our word hospitality. Just like hostis lies at the root of our word hostility. Okay? To convert the whole, but notice how there's sort of this cool sort of, closeness, at least in Latin, and how these words are pronounced, right? It's this cool sort of play on words. To convert the hostis into a hospes, the enemy into a guest, and to create the free and fearless space where brotherhood and sisterhood can be formed and fully experienced. If there is any concept worth restoring to its original depth and evocative potential, it is the concept of hospitality, right? Philoxenia, as I said, love of the stranger. You can see that xenos root in our word, like a xenophobic or xenophobia, which is fear of the stranger or the foreigner, right? It is one of the richest biblical terms that can deepen and broaden our insight in our relationships to our fellow human beings. Old and New Testament stories not only show how serious our obligation is to welcome the stranger in our home, but they also tell us that guests are carrying precious gifts with them, which they are eager to reveal to a receptive host. When hostility is converted into hospitality, then fearful strangers can become guests, revealing to their hosts the promise they are carrying with them. Then, in fact, the distinction between host and guest proves to be artificial and evaporates in the recognition of the newfound unity. Right, so there's that line from, back on the biblical quote page, it's just down underneath the Good Samaritan. There's that line from the letter to the Hebrews, in the beginning of chapter 13. Right, let mutual love continue. The word for mutual love is the word Philadelphia, right? You know the city Philadelphia literally means the love of brothers, right? Brotherly love. Love of our fellows, right? Or mutual, in a more inclusive sense. Let mutual love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers. There it is, philoxenia, love of the stranger. Hospitality. For by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it. What's being referenced there? Well, in the story right before that horrific account of what's happening in Sodom, right, in Genesis 19. In Genesis 18, Abraham welcomes these three mysterious guests, right? Strangers. They're strangers and they become guests. He welcomes them into his tent, right? It's there in chapter 18 of Genesis, as he's encamped by the oaks of Mamre. He welcomes them, and he doesn't know who they are yet at the moment, but they reveal themselves, and they're revealed to be God, right? And so there's sort of this tradition. I love the way the letter to the Hebrews, so this is sort of like the biblical allusion or echo to the Old Testament in the letter to the Hebrews, is that when we exercise philoxenia, hospitality, we don't know who we're bringing in, but it could just very well be God himself, or that we're entertaining angels that have come into our midst, right? This is what Abraham does. And that's the summons, I think, probably for all of us in the bigger picture of the church's social doctrine and the emphasis upon the duty we have to the other, the stranger, right? In sort of the big picture way, why the bishops and the Pope and others are really calling us sometimes in prophetic and challenging ways, and maybe sort of like the proverbial fingernails on the chalkboard, asking us, okay, who are we as a church, who are we as a society? And we always have to be about at least considering, the strangers that come into our midst and the migrants that come into our midst, and the very fact that in doing that, we just might be entertaining angels, and never to take that for granted. All right, so I'll conclude there and just thank you once again for letting me lead a little brief sort of scratching the surface, or at least very tip of the iceberg approach to a very complicated issue and situation, but I think something that we know deep down we're all compelled to at least sort of wrestle with, and in that wrestling with maybe come to a greater appreciation and love of the stranger in our midst. All right, thanks so much. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I've actually never heard it. Well, I was going to the Holy Land cancel all that. Yeah. Thank you.
Right there. Is
Oh, you're welcome. Oh, yeah. No, yeah.
Yeah, later. He had to take his truck into it this morning.
okay.
So he's coming in later. I'm not sure when.
Well, thank you so much for helping.
Thanks for looking after us for a few weeks. It was greatly appreciated, okay? You take care of yourself. Have a good spring, and we look forward to seeing you again, okay?
I'm just trying to see what the next.
What, just trying to get a heads up.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. He's got a million floating around in his head, I know.
I wish I could give you more.